LA Mayor Karen Bass advances to the November runoff in her bid for re-election, despite being challenged from the left and right and a rocky first term. The Democrats secured a spot for the final round of voting. Bass, for her own part, maintains that her 3 years as mayor have taken the city in the right direction. The incumbent mayor and former congresswoman will now head into a high-profile November showdown as voters decide whether to give her a second term. We're also following closely the fact that Spencer Pratt, firmly in second place behind Karen Bass in that mayoral primary. So a lot to get to this morning. Joining us next onto the program to discuss all of these developments is political analyst Rich Rubino. Rich, good morning.
Good morning again.
All right, you were with us yesterday. Let's focus specifically on the mayoral race. So Karen Bass, Spencer Pratt there. It hasn't been called the second spot for that race, but Spencer Pratt is close behind. Is this surprising to you?
I think it's surprising, not so much that it's not so much surprising today, but it certainly would have been a few months ago. I think a lot of people saw him as kind of a gadfly, if you will, kind of a very much a minor candidate. Perhaps some people thought that this was some sort of a publicity stunt, but there was really, he really galvanized a lot of support amongst those in Los Angeles who are really disheartened by the current mayor. So for that, in that respect, I think you see why there certainly is support for him. Now, if you go into the general election, assuming he is the actual second place finisher, Karen Bass is going to probably have this a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, she's going to say that Spencer Pratt is somebody who does not have that does not have experience. The other side of that is she's going to make Donald Trump the face card because Donald Trump is extremely unpopular. The national brand of the Republican Party is extremely unpopular in metropolitan Los Angeles. So she's going to try to use that. She's going to mention Trump just about every breath. The fact that Trump had endorsed him. Whereas Mr. Pratt, I think his strategy is going to say that he's independent-minded, that he's somebody who wants to, who's coming into power, that he wants to try to change things, but that he wants to work with both parties, that he's almost kind of nominally a Republican. So it'll be very interesting to see how both strategies play out.
You're talking about two very distinct strategies here when it comes to
Yes.
winning this election come mid-November. Based on what we've seen from the polling and what we've heard from voters down there on the ground and really their grievances heading into these elections, which strategy would most likely resonate most with Los Angelinos?
I think probably Karen Bass's strategy of trying to tether her opponent to Donald Trump and to try to make him the case that he's somebody who does not have experience, that he's somebody that is more or less somebody she's going to say that he's a reality TV star. But that being said, Spencer Pratt can actually use that to his advantage. As was aforementioned yesterday, politics is the only profession I can think of where experience and for that matter education are actually a liability, not an asset. If you say you're from outside of the system, if you say you're a non-politician, that actually works. That's actually politically advantageous for that candidate. So I think in that respect, Spencer Pratt can certainly use that for him. But that being said, it appears this is going to be a Democratic year. There's a lot of displeasure with the current administration in Washington. So rightly or wrongly, that's going to be used against him. And I think that's going to be basically the flagship strategy that Karen Bass is going to use in this campaign.
I want to bring up another social media post here, courtesy of Matthew Seedorf. He's a reporter, Fox 11 LA. He was at one of the events for Spencer Pratt today, and in this post he says, with votes still being counted, Spencer Pratt holds a sizable lead for second place and appears on track to advance to a runoff against Mayor Karen Bass. When I asked how he's feeling, Pratt replied, quote, obviously, God wanted 5 more months of me exposing all the failures of our mayor. For the next several months, Rich, do you think that he will be able to close that gap to make this a very close race between him and Karen Bass?
It's very hard for me to envision that to happen. Now, obviously, anything you say, obviously in politics is a very unpredictable profession, but because this is basically going to probably be a Democratic year. You take that you take that, and then the fact that Los Angeles is a very Democratic city. Now, it has elected Republican governors before. Richard Riordan, for example, was elected and reelected as governor of Los Angeles. But that being said, there are a lot more Democrats than there are Republicans in the city of Los Angeles, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the current administration. I think it's going to bring out But now, by the way, you may say, well, this is a mayoral race. This has nothing to do with the national administration. What it does is it's going to bring out, it's not necessarily the mayor's race per se, but just the fact that I just think that this election will bring out a lot of Democrats who are really galvanized, who are really have a lot of ire, really acrimonious relationship with the current administration. They want to vote against anybody who's a member of the same party as the administration. They want to vote for any Democrat they can. It doesn't mean necessarily that supportive of Karen Bass. It means that they're basically going to vote for somebody who's not Donald Trump or who's not part of the political party that Donald Trump is. That's why it's very hard for me to envisage a scenario where a Republican this year wins the mayoral race in Los Angeles.
I just want to ask one final point from Karen Bass, because you've talked a little bit about the strategy that she's taken, but also the strategy that Spencer Pratt has taken is to try to point out everything that has gone wrong since she has been mayor of Los Angeles. So what directly is she telling voters right now based off of some of the concerns that they have, the wildfires, the homelessness problem? How is she making this next run for mayor look different than from what already has been seen?
Well, what she's saying in terms of homeless, she's saying that homelessness has gone down, that crime has gone down, that poverty has gone down, and and foundationally that the people in a sense have not really seen it yet, but that she has to present that message. Obviously, Spencer Pratt is going to have a countervailing message. He's going to say that we can do a lot better, that we can bring crime a lot further down, and that's really what this campaign is going to be. And you're going to for the swing voter, it's about trying to find the nuances here and determine. Obviously, Spencer Pratt has a position, Karen Bass has a position, and the argument is usually somewhere in the middle. Obviously, in politics, there's a lot of technical truths you're going to hear. You're going to hear a lot of not necessarily lies, but you're going to hear a lot of lies by omission, if you will, by each candidate going after the other person. So it's going to be very interesting to see that. But I think that a lot of people might say national politics are not at play here, but national politics are really at play for everywhere from cemetery commission to governor to senator. They're really just about everywhere, and it really is an election about Donald Trump, but more than it's about an election about Karen Bass, about Spencer Pratt, or about any candidate for public office.
One more point here. The Associated Press has reported that California has a history of substantial vote updates after Election Day that can sometimes shift the outcome of those elections as late arriving mail and drop off votes are being counted. With that being said, Rich, is there any chance for an upset, maybe that we have another candidate take the lead?
I think I don't see it happening necessarily in the lead. This is called ballot hugging, for example, when people wait to the last minute. I don't see that scenario. I think, but not that it really matters one way or the other, because under California law, if no candidate garners the requisite 50% of the vote, an outright majority, then you have a runoff between the two candidates. So obviously, it's certainly something that, for bragging rights, you can say that if Spencer Pratt were to actually muster more support than Karen Bass, he could come out and he could say, "I'm now the preponderant front runner." But it really doesn't mean much. It comes down to the general election. There'll be two candidates, and those two candidates have to get an outright majority, 50% of the popular vote.
All right, Rich. Well, that was our roundup of the mayoral race there in Los Angeles. Karen Bass advancing. We do not yet know who is going to be the candidate going up against her, but those results, I'm sure we'll get them in within at least the next several days. At the moment, though, in the lead, Karen Bass, Spencer Pratt behind her. Rich Rubino, political analyst, stay with us here, because when we come back from this next commercial break, we are actually going to talk about another race in California, the gubernatorial race, and we'll talk a little bit about the primaries in Iowa. So, Rich, we'll see you in just a sec.
Okay.
And then for everyone else, stay with us. Back in 2 minutes. Taking a live look once again over in Los Angeles, California. Time right now, West Coast 3:10 in the morning, 6:10 here on the East Coast, but we are focused on California at this time because just before the commercial break and really all night long, we have been waiting for results to come in from these primaries. Now, we had touched on the fact that incumbent mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, has advanced to a runoff election. The Associated Press, however, has not called a second candidate to advance. I do want to head over to the governor's race, though, and touch on the updates there. Now, Republican Steve Hilton and Democrat Javier Becerra were leading the candidates in the race for governor, with Democrat Tom Steyer running slightly further behind. Joining us once again onto the program to discuss this and more is political analyst Rich Rubino. Rich, good to have you on again. You were with us yesterday while we were previewing these primaries. Today, we're getting a better look as to how voters went when they cast their ballot at the poll. Let's start with Steve Hilton, because at last check, he was in the lead to be governor of California. What do we think about this?
Yes, well, I think you have to look at it and you have to see that obviously there were a lot of Democratic candidates. There were two major Republican candidates, actually 61 candidates. It's just you hear about 8 of them, but there are actually 61 candidates on the ballot, and they were all in alphabetical order. But I think that I think that that lead is a little bit misleading because it's still well under 30% of the vote, and obviously in the general election, you're talking about for Vice President Harris. It has not gone for it has not gone for a Republican at the presidential level since George H.W. Bush won it back in 1988. So this is a very Democratic state. And in the general election, you're going to have supporters from Tom Steyer, from Congresswoman Katie Porter, from any other Democratic candidates, probably galvanizing for the Democratic nominee. So this does not mean in any extent of the imagination that that the Republican is that Mr. Hilton is somehow in the catbird seat here. He is still very much the underdog, and obviously this is probably going to be a Democratic type of a year. But that being said, it still is it's a very impressive performance for somebody who has the endorsement of Donald Trump. And there was another major Republican candidate candidate who ran as well, who did not fare as nearly as well as Mr. Hilton did.
And we'll talk about that candidate in just a moment, but let's stay with Steve Hilton for just a second here. And going back to a couple of points that you made here, a lot of people view California as a blue state really in its entirety. But, they did have a Republican governor. The last one was Arnold Schwarzenegger. He is the movie star, the bodybuilder. He was in office from 2003 to 2011. And also, I was reading that California has had more Republican governors than Democratic ones in the last 60 years. What state was California in to be electing Republican governors, and what's so different now?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Certainly, Ronald Reagan was elected twice as governor. He was elected in 67 and 66 rather, and then reelected in 1970. There was certainly George Adujian was elected twice as governor of California. Pete Wilson was elected governor of California in 1990. And then in 1994, he came back from about a 25-point disadvantage and actually landed up winning that against Kathleen Brown, the state treasurer at the time. So Republicans were elected governor. In Ronald Reagan's case, he was somewhat of a center-right type of a Republican. He actually raised taxes. He signed the Mugford Act, one of the largest gun control act legislations in American history at the time. He signed. He was very much pro-choice at one time when he was first elected governor. He moved further to the right when he ran for president. Pete Wilson was someone who supported abortion rights, who was kind of a moderate to it was basically a moderate, typical center-right Republican. He ran for president himself in 1996 and didn't get anywhere. But it's interesting. Republicans used to do very well in Orange County, and they used to do very well, and they still do very well in the Inland Empire. If you think about it, Kevin McCarthy, for example, the last Speaker of the House, actually represented Bakersfield, California. So he actually came from California, and that is an overwhelmingly Republican part of the state. When Pete Wilson and Ronald Reagan ran, they did not do well in necessarily places like Los Angeles or San Francisco, but they made it up for it in the rest of the state. So it's a very interesting dynamic. That being said, they can also sometimes, when you're running for governor of California, at least more in recent times, and you have Democrats with overwhelming control of both the supermajorities of both houses in the state legislature, all you have to do is essentially say that I'm going to be a check on the other party. And sometimes it can work when you're running for governor. When you're running for a seat like United States Senate, it's a lot harder because when you're running for a United States Senate seat, you're immediately part of the leadership. In Arnold Schwarzenegger's case, he was actually elected in a recall election. And the recall election back in 2003, Gray Davis was first elected in 1998, then reelected in 2002, and he became exceedingly unpopular. So there was a recall election, and there was a litany of candidates that ran. Tom McClintock, a congressman from California, was another candidate on the ballot, and Arnold Schwarzenegger ended up winning a plurality in that race. And then he became relatively popular, got reelected on his own, and got reelected in his own, and then in 2006, and then served out till 2010. They haven't been a Republican governor since. The state has become more and more Democrat, which I think makes it more of an austere challenge for a Republican to win. But that being said, there is a history of in extremely blue states of red governors winning, just like contrastly there has been a history of places like Kentucky, for example, where they have a Democratic governor, or even Arkansas, Wyoming had a Democratic governor, David Frudenthal, for example, and that's a state that's currently about 77% of registered voters are actually Republicans. So there is some history for it, but it's still a very austere challenge.
So breaking it down a little bit there for Steve Helton, I want to talk about Javier Becerra because he was a second, at least within the latest polling. Of course, a lot of those votes are still being counted, but Javier Becerra is looking like he's leading, at least from the two Democratic candidates that we were talking about yesterday. In his case, he would be the state's first Latino governor since the late 1800s. And what's interesting about that is that nearly 1/3 of California voters today identify as Hispanic or Latino. It's the second highest share among all U.S. states. Is Becerra being Latino something that voters can gravitate to, or does he have to count on something else to be able to win it all the way?
I think he has to count on something else. I think Latino is not they're not certainly are not a monolith. They're a litany of different types of Latino voters. Are not, so you can't say that necessarily that if you do well with, for example, Mexican Americans, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing well with those from Cuba or those from Honduras or those from Venezuela. So what he has to do is he really has to galvanize Democratic voters, and then he has to reach out to independents and some what there are of dissatisfied Republicans. He has the advantage of this likely being a Democratic year, the fact that Donald Trump has a job approval rating of under 40%. It's very low in the state of California. So what he has to do is he really has to kind of alligate his opponent with Donald Trump. That has to be part of his strategy. And then he has to obviously talk about his own plans for affordability. It's very interesting how he became the front runner, because if you go back a year or two ago, people were looking at some of the heavy hitters of the Democratic Party. Vice President Harris, she decided not to run. Senator Alex Padilla, who took the seat that Harris had once had in the Senate, she didn't run. Bob Banto, the Attorney General, didn't run. So you had a litany of other candidates, and in that respect, Mr. Becerra worked really assiduously and landed up actually garnering more votes than any other Democratic candidate in this race. I think assuming that it is both of these two candidates, he certainly goes in as the ultimate favorite. And the other candidate, Tom Steyer, who you mentioned earlier, very interesting. Reminds me of Al Checky, who ran in 1998 against Gray Davis in the Democratic primary. He spent about $40 million. How much that would be in today's money, I don't know, but he garnered about 12.9% of the vote, and that was of his own money. He was, Northwest Airlines fame. So this is very similar in terms of Tom Steyer. He's somebody who ran for president in 2020, did not really go anywhere in that. So it does show, I guess, that money can certainly get somebody's message out. You can pocket a lot of name recognition, but it doesn't necessarily translate into votes. That's assuming that he actually does come in third place and is not one of the top two finishers here.
And let's assume that for a fact. We do have some video here of Tom Steyer, because that is one of the points I wanted to hit on. With him spending over $200 million of his own money, he sets the record for both the costliest campaign this year and in California gubernatorial history. So with all that money spent here on this campaign, Rich, what was it about Tom Steyer that perhaps did not resonate to voters?
It's very interesting. So Tom Steyer is a billionaire, and there's a movement. You hear this from AOC, you hear this from Bernie Sanders, you hear this from Congressman Ro Khanna from California, very much going after billionaires. Now he has an interesting message. What he's saying is, I'm the billionaire who's going to spend my own money, but I'm going to then tax billionaires when I actually get into office. But he was very much self-funded. I think there was a lot of people. There was for a lot of people that was a little bit off-putting, if you will, the idea that you'd have a billionaire as governor. So I think they didn't want somebody that was they didn't want that kind of corporate CEO type of a culture. So I think that's why perhaps they were looking at other candidates. That being said, he didn't do that poorly. He just did not do as well as I think his money would have potentially would have put him ahead. But as I say, there's the American political scene is littered with, whether it's Steve Forbes, for example, who ran in 1996 and ran in 2000, other candidates who spent a lot of their own money, who were very much self-funded, who did not do very well in the general election. So money can get you money can get you name recognition, money can get you into the debates, money can get you to at least be considered by the Vox Populi. But at the end of the day, you really have to work hard to get those votes, and sometimes it can actually be counterintuitive, and there are countervailing pressures for a lot of people to say we don't want somebody to try to buy the governorship of California or any other state for that matter.
We've been focused a lot on California, but before I let you go, Rich, I do want to touch on another headline and another primary that we were watching very closely. This one takes out to Iowa. Want to bring us out to this. It's a social media post courtesy of Fox News. It says Trump endorsed Republican Randy Feenstra lost Iowa's Republican gubernatorial primary Tuesday night to businessman and farmer Zach Land. Trump had praised Feenstra as MAGA all the way in a last-minute Truth Social endorsement last week, and the congressman was widely expected to win the race. The upset marks a notable break from recent GOP primaries in states like Texas and Kentucky, where Trump-backed candidates prevailed. Land now advances to Iowa's general election on November 3rd. Based off of what we saw here, I also want to bring another point, though. Joe Mitchell did win the Republican nomination for U.S. House in Iowa's 2nd congressional district. Joe Mitchell was also endorsed by President Trump. So what is different about these two candidates, Rich? Why did one of them win in their primary and one of them did not?
That's a great question. I think first of all, what it shows is that Donald Trump does not have an absolute vice grip over the Republican Party. Not all Republicans, not all conservative Republicans are going to vote based on what Donald Trump says, who Donald Trump says they're going to vote for. And that being said, Donald Trump's endorsement in that race was in the gubernatorial race was very late, so that the candidate could not come out and make a political ad that fast, make as many political ads with Donald Trump in that ad. I think that what's different in the case of Mr. Mitchell is it was one congressional seat, so it's a lot less voters, and that's probably why he won support and why he won that race in particular. The Iowa gubernatorial race is going to be very interesting. It's going to really be ground zero here in terms of how well the Democrats can do in terms of winning a rural state. This is a state that used to be very Democrat. Bill Clinton won it twice, for example. It's become more and more Republican. Last time around, it wasn't even contested, really, and Donald Trump won it by 13 points. But the Democrats only have currently the Republicans control both houses of the state legislature. They control the governorship. They have both Senate seats, and they have every constitutional office except one. State Auditor Rob Sand, the 43-year-old state auditor, who is very much kind of advertised himself as a rural type of a Democrat, goes, for example, talks about how he goes hunting and how he's really part of the rural culture. This is going to be very interesting to see how well a Democrat who tries to run as a rural Democrat does in a gubernatorial race. He's somebody who's very popular. He's someone who potentially could siphon off some Republican support, some independent support. And you have a candidate in the United States Senate, Josh Turk, who is actually more of the establishment candidate. Chuck Schumer's PAC and endorsed him for giving him money. Vote Vets had given him money. He's somebody who's very, very interesting. He currently represents the Council Bluffs, Iowa, in this part of the state of in the state as a state representative. No Democrat represents a more red part of Iowa than he does. So he knows what it is to get votes in the very conservative parts of Iowa. That being said, this is still a very conservative state. Ashley Hinson is the Republican nominee. She's someone who represents the northwest corner of Iowa, and I think it's be very interesting to see in a Democratic year. Potentially, the Democrats could siphon off a rural state. If that is the case, then I think that he will be seen as one of the kind of the shining stars of the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party currently has a real problem garnering electoral support in rural America.
Rich Rubino, political analyst and historian. Rich, we talked about a lot today. Still, we have some more of this to look forward to for the rest of the year. We are in a midterm election year, so a lot to get to. But as always, Rich, good to see you.
Elections never end.
They never do, man. I feel like it was just yesterday. We're in the presidential election, and now we're here again. So we'll be speaking soon, Rich. Thank you.
All right.